Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. This is the Fast Friday edition of the show for November 15th, 2019. Today, I'm going to do a bit of a rapid fire, well, as best as I can, through 5 important points about the Constitution and war powers. And from there, I want to give you an update on how legislators in 20 or so states are expecting to file bills for the 2020 legislative session to end unconstitutional deployments of National Guard troops. First of all, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. We're on all kinds of different channels and platforms, both video and audio. You can find all of those. You can find all of our archives, all of the show notes. I have all kinds of links for each episode that you could reference and read more or watch more videos. You can find all of our social media channels, the ways to subscribe to our newsletter, and even support us if you want to kick in financially for as little as $2 a month, which goes a long, long way. Find all of that over on our website at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Now, since this is the Fast Friday edition of the show, I don't want to take up too much of your time, so let's get right to it and see if I can get this done in about 10 to 15 minutes. So here's where we're starting. First of all, with the Constitution. 5 important points about the Constitution and war powers. So the power to declare war, that is to change the situation from a state of peace to a state of war, that has been delegated to Congress in the Constitution. We can see this in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, where it says Congress shall have power to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is that Congress has not followed this requirement since World War II. All of the conflicts around the world that the U.S. has engaged in, none of them have been accompanied by a constitutionally authorized declaration of war. And so for that matter, the executive branch hasn't followed it either. What they've done instead of having an actual declaration of war is they've passed either a continuing resolution or some kind of authorization, basically telling the executive branch that the president can decide who, what, where, if, when, etc., rather than Congress making this decision. But nothing in the Constitution authorizes one branch of the federal government to redelegate a power delegated to it to another branch. So, for example, the president could not pick out a Supreme Court justice and say, well, for this situation, you're the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy. It just can't be done. So this hasn't been followed since World War II, a long, long time. The third important point is that a lot of people believe that the president doesn't have to follow this. As long as the president is only engaged in hostilities in other countries for 30 or 60 or 90 days, just a short amount of time, and then the president reports back to Congress, what they're really talking about is something passed in 1973, the War Powers Act or War Powers Resolution. I did a video on this early in 2018, a couple of minutes. It's like 2 minutes. I put the link in the show notes for those of you watching. I've got it pulled up here. And the short version is there's nothing in the Constitution that says this. They've basically changed the Constitution by fiat, by passing something that says they can do something that wasn't delegated in the first place. So the fourth point, we're going right to James Madison. And Madison talked about the power of war a lot. So did a lot of the founders. This is a very concerning issue for all of them. And here he put it this way: the executive has no right in any case, to decide the question whether there is or is not cause for declaring war. So the executive, whether it's 30 days, 60 days, whatever reason someone may come up with, James Madison said there's no situation where the executive has this power, period. Now, if someone attacks, they've changed the state of things from peace to war, so the executive isn't making that decision, someone else does. The executive never gets to make this decision, according to James Madison. And if it's some political pundit or some expert or some scholar or some politician and their opinion versus James Madison, this is easy peasy for me. It's James Madison every single time. That's point number 4. And point number 5, it's like if you're playing whack-a-mole at this point, if you get this far with someone and you're telling them these 4 points, and maybe they're like, oh, okay, yeah, but that doesn't really count as war. They'll often say that something doesn't really count as war, so therefore it doesn't need to be followed. And I've covered this on this program a number of times, so just a brief reminder. This is from constitutional scholar Rob Natelson, who's done a lot of great work on this. He says, founding era dictionaries and other sources, both legal and lay, tell us that when the Constitution was approved, the word war consisted of any hostilities initiated by a sovereign over opposition. Here from Barlow's Dictionary of 1772 to 73, it was the exercise of violence under sovereign command against such as oppose. So they'll just claim it's not a war, but a war is a war, whether they want to call it a war or something else, and therefore Congress is the one who decides whether or not it will be a state of peace or war. So that's 5 important points that I wanted to start out with to set the foundation. But moving forward, as I mentioned in Wednesday's show, Thomas Jefferson told us that anytime, let me pull this up here. Thomas Jefferson told us that anytime the federal government exercises powers that haven't been delegated to it in the Constitution, quote, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. In other words, states need to do something about it. States absolutely have to do something about it. And I will link to this article covering Thomas Jefferson's Kentucky resolutions of 1798, which were just passed this week in history that year. So November 10th in the House, November 13th in the state Senate, and then signed by the governor on the 16th. So tomorrow. And that's Jefferson's view. So I'll go with him and Madison just about any single time. And then from there, Daniel Webster in 1814, in a speech, a very famous speech in Congress, he applied this same approach, this Jeffersonian approach, to war powers. Check this out. He says, the operation of measures thus unconstitutional and illegal ought to be prevented by a resort to other measures which are both constitutional and legal. So if they're doing something wrong in Washington, D.C., it has to be opposed. Has to be prevented. You resort to other measures that are constitutional and legal to stop them. And he says, quote, it will be the solemn duty of the state governments to protect their own authority over their own militia and to interpose, his words, interpose between their citizens and arbitrary power. Arbitrary power, all the founders knew what this was. And I'm no fan of Daniel Webster. He's very much hated in many situations, but I think he understood this part of it at least. Arbitrary power is power that has not been delegated. This is a usurpation, a theft of power. So he's saying that when the federal government is calling on people to go into war when they shouldn't, the states are supposed to, it's their duty, solemn duty to interpose against the federal government to stop it. He says these are among the objects for which the state governments exist. The state governments are there to act as a bulwark, a roadblock to the federal government doing whatever they want. And their highest obligations bind them to the preservation of their own rights and the liberties of their people. So with all this in mind, a newly created organization just from earlier this year, bringourtroopshome.us. This is founded by a veteran up in Idaho and has got a lot of members around the country already. They announced this week that legislators in about 20 states, I think it might be as many as 22, will be filing a piece of legislation called the Defend the Guard Act. Here, this is from the Sheridan Press. This is in Sheridan, Wyoming. Bring Our Troops Home is working on legislation in 22 states intended to hold the federal government accountable by requiring Congress to pass an authorization of military force. Well, that's, I think, they're actually the news people there are reporting this incorrectly. To pass an authorization of military force before deploying National Guard members to combat zones. But listen to the quote from Dan McKnight, the founder. He's a sergeant in the Idaho National Guard. He said, absent a declaration of war, they're to stay home and do what the National Guard is supposed to do, which is defend the country and repel invasion and help during times of national disasters. They have to have a declaration of war, not just some authorization that says, executive branch, we're authorizing you to do stuff. You just decide against which country, where, when, whom, and why. That's not a declaration of war. So the legislation, the Defend the Guard Act, requires that they follow the Constitution before the state will relinquish or allow their troops to be federalized and then called into federal service, especially in foreign countries. So 22 states. I mean, we've been working on this for a number of years, and a guy named Pat McGeehan, delegate in West Virginia, who Mike Meharry interviewed over the summer talking about this, has been working tirelessly for years on this. And they, at their event at the National Press Club this week, they had this kind of roundtable, a talk from all the different people who are participating, and McGeehan did awesome, as usual. But we posted this video on the blog, 10th Amendment Center blog. Mike Meharry wrote about it a little bit and highlighted some of the issues. So McGeehan has filed this bill for 4 or 5 years in a row now. And at first it just kind of sat there, but finally he got it on the House agenda. And what happened? This is from Mike's report. The Adjutant General of the West Virginia National Guard called the Speaker of the West Virginia House and demanded an immediate meeting. McGeehan said the general showed up to that meeting in full military getup. That's how McGeehan described it. He said, sort of looking like Jack Nicholson did in A Few Good Men. The general claimed he got a call from the Pentagon threatening to pull out all West Virginia National Guard bases on the base realignment and closure list, BRAC list. So the bill basically, I think it got out of committee, so it got on an agenda. And as soon as it got on an agenda, they get a call from the head of the National Guard, a major general in West Virginia, who was called by the Pentagon and said, you need to do something about this. And what did McGeehan say? I mean, it's just paraphrasing, but he basically said, look, man, this kind of opposition, the fact they're coming down so hard on this, they're so aggressive, and they're obviously watching this, that means they're concerned about what we're doing, that the strategy is good. The strategy will work. It should be a green light to all of us that the stronger the opposition to something, the more aggressive they are in trying to shut it down. If they're sending a decked out general, a major general, whatever, if the Pentagon is getting involved and they're trying to shut things down and threatening closure of bases and things like that, that means they're fearful of the result of ignoring it. So this is how Meharry put it. During the panel discussion, McGeehan explained the pushback he's gotten on the bill. He said the opposition tells him the bill would be effective. I think that might be an understatement. Another thing that he said that I thought was really pretty interesting, and I'd like to see a confirmation on this, but he pointed out that basically at the height of the Iraq War, as much or close to, even if it isn't super close, but he said close to 50% of the troops in Iraq were from the National Guard. So this kind of approach has the potential to have a significant impact on unconstitutional foreign wars, unconstitutional wars of the federal government, that people have been protesting in Washington, D.C. for decades against war, decades and decades of protest against war. Well, you could all go all the way back to World War I if you really want to dig in deep. But let's say from the 60s forward, aggressive, large-scale protests against war. They've been voting bums out. They've been trying to support peace candidates. I mean, if you think of the last 3 presidents, each one of them have basically campaigned on a more humble foreign policy. You had one president win a Nobel Peace Prize, and there's still more wars. There's always more war, more occupation, more bombing. None of that is working. But when the Pentagon sees something like this, and they're regressively targeting the Speaker of the House of West Virginia, saying, look, you better stop this bill, you know they're concerned about the strategy. Now, whether or not we're going to be able to push it over the top is another question, but I think that says quite a bit. And then finally here, oh, and Pat actually wrote a really good column supporting his legislation that we reposted here in September. I'll link to that in the show note episode as well. And here's the link to the Defend the Guard Act. This is our version of it. I know everyone's kind of modified a little bit. They have their own version. We actually got this from another organization that was around years ago, Guard the Guard, and we put our own basically focus, constitutional focus into it. So it has a number of clauses talking about these things. And then it's very simple. It basically just says, you know, you have to follow the Constitution before you can't call up the Guard for whatever. You have to follow the Constitution in order to do that. And if you're not going to, we're not going to let you do that. And I know some people are going to say, well, you can't try to stop them. But if no one tries to stop them this way, everything else has failed already. So this, I believe, just like Thomas Jefferson recommended, this is absolutely the way to go. So, you know, in closing, I guess if you're like me, you probably see every single foreign conflict that the U.S. has been involved in your lifetime, since World War II at least, as being a violation of the Constitution one way or the other. And I think the best way to support the troops, is to follow the Constitution and bring them home as soon as possible. And that should be today, not tomorrow, right now. And here's how James Madison, one more quote from James Madison that I think is really, really good to hammer home. He put it this way: armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. And he says armies lead to debts and taxes. And that's when he went into the rest of the quote. So armies, debts, and taxes are the known instruments all through history of putting the many under the domination of the few. Well, I hope you found this educational and interesting. Most importantly, I hope you learned something from this episode. I hope you'll take that model legislation once we get that posted on the site and send it to your state representative and state senator. Urge them to either co-sponsor a bill that's already been filed, like in Wyoming, we know that's coming, in West Virginia, have them co-sponsor support, or file it themselves. Feel free to email us if you've got questions about it, team@10thamendmentcenter.com, or just leave a comment and I will look at all of them. I don't get a chance to reply to every single one, but if you've got some questions about it, I'd love to be able to get back to you as much as possible. Again, thank you for spending some time with me today. I hope you found this to be a good episode and I hope you learned something. I hope you have an awesome weekend and we'll see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.